To our Great Communicators Series, sponsored by the Reagan Institute. The mission of the Reagan Institute is to carry the enduring principles of President Reagan forward into the future, but I want to start today by taking you back 8 years ago to Simi Valley, California at the Reagan Presidential Library. Nancy Reagan was there welcoming a special guest who had come to speak at her personal invitation. And unlike many speakers at the Reagan Library, her guest was not an elder statesman from the Reagan administration or a longtime friend from her Washington days. In fact, her guest was only 9 years old when Ronald Reagan became president. The speaker that night hadn't spent much time in Washington at all. He'd arrived there only a few months earlier. But Nancy Reagan, intensely devoted to her husband's legacy, was telling the world that this was no ordinary Reagan Library guest. And she was right. The speaker who wowed the audience that night and made headlines the next morning was Senator Marco Rubio, the young senator who had rocketed from winning an upset race to being dubbed a future presidential contender in just a matter of days. And that was because many in America saw what Nancy Reagan saw, that this son of immigrants was truly a great communicator and spoke the values that President Reagan long championed. 8 years later, the upstart is now the senior senator from Florida and has proven himself to be a proponent not only of an optimistic view of America, but also a vision of the world that is free from oppression and values essential human rights. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, China. The senator has been fearless in calling for greater personal and economic freedom in countries where it is routinely denied. Senator Rubio has also been outspoken in the efforts to seek justice for Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered last year by agents of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. By working in Congress to uphold Jamal's killers to account, the senator has been an important advocate for a free press. And by urging our own government not to turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's brazen violations of human rights, Senator Rubio has championed the values of liberty and decency that truly make America great. Respect for individual liberty and human rights around the world was central to the Reagan presidency. And today, April 30th, marks the 35th anniversary of one of President Reagan's most important, yet probably less appreciated speeches, when he took the message of freedom and democracy to a place that was anything but. On April 30th, 1984, President Reagan addressed the students of Fudan University in Shanghai. In the heart of the communist nation, he told students about America and what it means to live in a free society. And he said at the time, quote, "We are an optimistic people. Like you, we inherited a vast land of endless skies, tall mountains, rich fields, and open prairies. It made us see the possibilities in everything. It made us hopeful. And we devised an economic system that rewarded individual effort and gave us good reason for hope. In America," President Reagan explained, "we elect our government by the vote of the people. That is how we choose our Congress and our president. We say of our country, here, the people rule." 35 years later, China is a different country in many ways, but communism remains its guiding philosophy. China's leaders have not wavered in their hostility towards true personal freedom. So where does that leave us today? How does America stand against oppression and for democracy in a country that is much an economic partner as it is a global rival? That job falls to our elected leaders like Senator Marco Rubio, who has rightly said that the U.S. response to China will define the 21st century. We're pleased to continue our Reagan Institute Great Communicators Series with Senator Marco Rubio of Florida today. And ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to turn your attention to this brief video highlighting President Reagan's landmark speech at Fudan University, and then join me in welcoming Senator Rubio to the stage.
We elect our government by the vote of the people. That is how we choose our Congress and our president. We say of our country, here the people rule, and it is so. Sometimes in America, some of our people may disagree with each other. We are often a highly disputatious nation. We rather like to argue. We're free to disagree among ourselves, and we do. But we always hold together as a society. We've held together for more than 200 years because we're united by certain things in which we all believe, things to which we've quietly pledged our deepest loyalties. To many Americans, China is still a faraway place, unknown, unseen, and fascinating. And we are fascinated. Now, you know as I do that there's much that naturally divides us. Time and space, different languages and values, different cultures and histories, and political systems that are fundamentally different. It would be foolish not to acknowledge these differences. My young friends, history is a river that may take us as it will, but we have the power to navigate, to choose direction, and make our passage together.
Please welcome Senator Marco Rubio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Well, first, thank you, Fred, and for inviting me, for introducing me. It's very kind. I want to thank Josh Highbush and Roger Sackheim and Rachel Hoff and your colleagues at the Institute for giving me this opportunity for organizing this event to mark the 35th anniversary of that speech, of which you just saw a snippet of it a moment ago. I wanted to spend today with you doing three things. The first is I wanted to talk about the historic significance of that speech, not just to U.S.-China relations, but to the cause of freedom and liberty around the world. And then I wanted to turn to the complex and challenging the relationship today between China in the 21st century and in our country. And third, some of the difficult choices we face with regards to that relationship. Let's talk first about the speech. Some of you here today probably don't remember that speech very well. In 1984, I would have been in 8th grade. Actually, April 84, I would have been in 7th grade. I remember that year only because it was Dan Marino's second year and the Dolphins were a football team, but we're coming back. But many people who worked for me weren't even born in 1984. But it was part, as you said, of that historic 6-day visit. And it was directed at the Chinese people. And the speech was typical Reagan. It overflowed with hope and optimism. That short snippet gave you some insight into that. And in it, he spoke about the growing educational and cultural exchanges, how it could increase mutual understanding between the United States and China. He called for greater bilateral cooperation in the fields of science and technology and medicine. And he aspired for the U.S.-China relationship to be one that realized a greater community of common interest and defined new political will to solve the world's intractable problems. Today, those optimistic words about cooperation with China seem naive, out of touch, and out of place. But that's 35 years later. The China in the 1980s was not yet the China that we know today. It was still emerging at that time from the traumas and the tragedies of Mao's Cultural Revolution. It was in the process of industrializing and modernizing. And it was still having a very vibrant internal debate about how to engage with the wider world economically, culturally, and in other ways. But there's something about that speech that stands the test of time, and that is championing the cause of individual liberty and freedom and democracy. The America that Reagan described to this Chinese audience, which was an audience, frankly, that at the time was largely unaware. It wasn't like the world today, where you have millions of Chinese citizens who travel throughout the world and are well aware of what the rest of the world looks like. China in 1984, the vast majority of its people, certainly the vast majority of those young people that heard that speech live, had very little understanding about America or the West, at least as we would understand it. And so they were largely unfamiliar. But the America that he described is actually a challenge to us today, where he talks about a resourceful nation of immigrants. including Chinese immigrants who were making important contributions. He extolled our fair-mindedness, our idealism, our compassion, our religion, faith, and he also talked about our differences, about how we were a people who vibrantly disagreed with one another, yet held together as one nation. And it is a reminder and a challenge of, in our modern era, why that is first and foremost the greatest contribution that we can make to the world, is our own example. Not just our system of self-governance, not just our ability to hold elections that are valid and credible, but the ability to recognize that despite our massive differences, we are one people, united by one nation, who share this one nation, and a people who share a nation that was founded on the powerful belief in the dignity of each man, woman, and child, and founded on our belief, as stated in the words of our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, because they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is important for us to continue to remember these things, even in our modern era, because it is, if we lose that understanding, then we have no standing at all to speak about liberty and freedom and what it can produce in a society anywhere in the world. I would say that in 1984 especially, few of any Chinese had ever heard a foreign leader speak that way on their soil. He did so eloquently, as Reagan always did, and he perhaps maybe even inspired young people in that crowd to dream for more. I certainly would like to think so. I would add that those daring remarks came about 5 years before the pro-democracy protesters took to Tiananmen Square to call for reforms and change. And while the Chinese Communist Party has spent the last 3 decades trying to erase the names and the memory of many of the Tiananmen protesters, their bravery, the bravery of those young Chinese in the face of certain danger, leaves us still in awe, particularly a reminder that the principles of freedom, democracy, and self-rule that Reagan spoke about, these are not American principles. These are principles deeply embedded in the heart and in the mind of every single human being, and that history has often been a struggle between those fighting to defend those principles and those seeking to deny them. And that desire for liberty is universal, it is immortal, it is as old as mankind's presence on the earth itself, which leads us to the challenge of China in the 21st century. As we approach this now 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, we are reminded that for 3 decades, many had hoped for development of a cooperative and mutually beneficial relation with China. President Clinton pursued constructive engagement to help re-energize China's global integration. The Bush administration encouraged China to embrace a new role of responsible stakeholder in the international community. And then more recently, President Obama advanced an Asia pivot. He, of course, declined to directly acknowledge China as the revisionist geopolitical rival that by then it had become. But now I believe we've reached a new turning point, and one that must be handled carefully, but must be handled. And that is the growing and widespread recognition in this city and across American policymaking that China, under Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, has become a near-peer strategic competitor to the United States and ultimately to the cause of freedom around the world. And I reiterate what I just said a moment ago, not China, but President Xi and the Communist Party of China have positioned China to become a near-peer rival to the United States. Its military is growing in size and sophistication and aggressiveness. It's aligned geopolitically with Russia, with Iran, with Maduro in Venezuela, North Korea, to not just promote, but to protect totalitarianism. In fact, to offer totalitarianism, their form of totalitarianism, as an acceptable alternative, perhaps even a more effective one than what they couch as the chaos and unruliness of the free world. It has also, by the way, under President Xi and some of his predecessors, used our own free and open international order against us. The Communist Party in China has overseen the greatest illegitimate transfer of wealth in human history, using forced technology transfer and a whole-of-nation approach in espionage to steal American innovation and ingenuity from our companies, our centers of research, our universities. In fact, the U.S. Office of Trade representative recently estimated that Chinese intellectual property theft costs the United States as much as $600 billion annually, a staggering amount Staggering amount. It exceeds the collective profit of the top 50 companies from the Fortune 500. Increased trade with China yielded some short-term benefits for consumers, there's no doubt about it, primarily in the form of lower prices, and short-term advantages for American companies in the form of higher profit margins. But the so-called China shock, the cumulative impact of China's entry into the international trade system, wiped out more than 2.4 million American jobs from 1999 to 2011. And the China shock devastated American small and medium-sized manufacturers in concentrated areas throughout the country. It is the result of that is some of the political anxiety that we see manifested in recent elections. Under President Xi, Beijing is just getting started. It's now boldly pursuing an industrial policy called Made in China 2025, with the goal of eventually displacing America and other industrialized nations and dominating global exports in key next-generation technology sectors. Beijing, for example, is subsidizing Chinese state-directed telecoms, companies like Huawei and ZTE, to ensure that they dominate the future of emerging 5G networks around the world. As the director of the FBI has warned, such power over our telecoms provides the capacity to exert pressure or control over our telecommunications infrastructure. It provides the capacity to maliciously modify or steal information, and it provides the capacity to conduct undetected espionage. By the way, that was a quote. I should have said quote from the FBI director. China uses its growing and unfettered access to America's $40 trillion capital markets to finance these threatening activities. American investors and fund managers and pension holders are often unwittingly investing in funds that hold Chinese companies like Hikvision and Dahua Technology with concealed ties to China's military, espionage, or human rights abuses. And it uses the weight of its massive economy to extend the long arm of its authoritarianism in efforts to bully or to bribe other nations to bend to its will. One example of this is the Belt and Road Initiative, through which it carries out debt trap diplomacy, entrapping debt-ridden foreign governments with extravagant promises of investment for their infrastructure projects. Some countries have already learned the hard lesson of this, and of this debt trap diplomacy. Sri Lanka, for example, as many of you well know, it's been well documented, lost control of a major port after defaulting on a Chinese loan. Other countries are naively ignoring the risks, like Italy, which became the first G7 nation to sign onto the Belt and Road Initiative. To cite another example, Beijing is increasingly using threats to deny access to its vast markets and economy if companies do not agree to its demand to isolate our ally Taiwan, or to conform to Chinese political correctness on topics like Tibet, Hong Kong, Macau. What's more, China is using a whole-of-nation approach to exploit the open societies of democracy, including our political systems and our universities, and exert malign influence that is covert, coercive, and corrupt, not only in places like Taiwan, Australia, Europe, and Latin America, but also here in the United States. Its malign activities have included spreading propaganda and misinformation, censoring foreign criticism of the communist regime, and even using Chinese students and academics to steal technology and trade secrets and proprietary data and research and development. Last, but certainly not least, China has left no doubt that under President Xi it will continue to be a totalitarian power. In the decades since Tiananmen, the Chinese government and the Communist Party have only tightened their grip. This has only accelerated in the last few years. And they've only accelerated as well in brutally suppressing dissent at home. For example, they continue to perfect the surveillance and monitoring of its own people, including omnipresent cameras, artificial intelligence-driven facial recognition, and the so-called social credit system that rates a Chinese citizen based on their compliance with the government. In fact, they're not only doing this at home, they are exporting it around the world as a safety and law enforcement feature. And you can imagine how attractive this sort of technology is to totalitarian governments. They've also left no doubt that it's one of the world's worst abusers of human rights and the rule of law. Look no further than the disappeared human rights lawyers, the imprisoned Christian pastor, or the unjust detention and tragic death of Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo. Look no further than Hong Kong, where Beijing continues to undermine and erode, not to mention break, the promises it made about Hong Kong's long-cherished autonomy. Look no further than their harsh policies against unregistered Christian churches, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and other religious adherents. And look no further than Xinjiang, where China has concentrated over 1 million Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minorities in what they call vocational schools or re-education camps, but what we would recognize as prison camps, establishing Orwellian levels of high-tech surveillance and monitoring, including the forced providing of people's DNA. What Xi Jinping calls the Chinese dream has for millions of people become a brutal and unending nightmare. These are some of the many challenges that modern-day Xi Jinping-led Chinese Communist Party pose to the free world. And so, while we hope for something different and believe that China has the potential for something vastly different, we must undertake the task of reorienting our foreign and domestic policies to bring balance to our relationship with them. This new approach must be built on 4 imperatives. Those 4 imperatives are sovereignty and reciprocity, transparency, and a commitment, a Reagan-like commitment, to protecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The Trump administration's effort to deal with unfair trade practices by China is not just about trade. At its core, it's about defending sovereignty and demanding reciprocity. We cannot give in to some of the pressure that you read about to enter into a bad deal. A good deal, the right deal, an acceptable one, is one that achieves the goals that the President himself outlined last year, namely, meaningful and fully enforceable structural changes on forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, non-tariff barriers, and cybersecurity. Our efforts to defend our sovereignty and secure reciprocity also requires us to address Made in China 2025 and other forms of industrial policy. As I outlined in a report titled Made in China 2025 and the Future of American Industry, which we did out of the Small Business Committee in the Senate that I chair, this growth agenda requires us to focus on domestic physical investment and domestic labor stabilization. This is not just something that we need to focus on externally, but internally, to prioritize national development and economic dynamism and small business competitiveness at the small, medium, and large business levels. It also means we have to enact in-kind and reciprocal responses to malicious Chinese trade and industrial practices, including developing our own approach to industrial policy and strategy to compete and win in this new 21st century. The imperative of transparency requires that we must establish strengthened disclosure requirements to alert American investors about the presence in the U.S. capital markets of Chinese companies that pose national security dangers or that are complicit in China's human rights abuses. Many Americans, if not most, would be rightly troubled, even outraged, to learn that their retirement and other investment dollars are funding companies with links to the Chinese government's security apparatus and malevolent behavior, links that represent real, material, asymmetric risks to corporate reputation and share value. Sovereignty and transparency also require us not to cede the future of 5G networks to Chinese state-directed companies like Huawei. Ultra-fast 5G networks will fundamentally transform the speed, the magnitude by which we connect and do business in the 21st century. It will enable our innovators to develop the Internet of Things, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, and the like. But whoever ends up developing and deploying 5G networks first is going to determine what those standards of all the industries that depend on it are. Therefore, this is not just an economic security issue, it's a national security issue. On this point, I know the U.S. government's doing a lot. I've worked closely with my colleague from Virginia, Senator Mark Warner, the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to do our part to warn our allies, including the so-called Five Eyes nations of Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, about the threat that these 5G networks pose. Australia, for example, took a very significant step last year when it established country-neutral criteria that prohibits foreign companies who are beholden in extrajudicial ways to foreign governments for participating in both the core and edge of its future 5G networks. This will effectively ban Huawei and ZTE from doing that in Australia. But we should be alarmed that one of our closest allies in the world, the United Kingdom, may choose to go in a different direction on 5G. There were news reports last week that Britain may be set to allow China to participate in its 5G networks. And these reports, by the way, coincided with the British Chancellor's trip to Beijing for the second annual Belt and Road Forum. It's my understanding, and frankly my earnest hope, that the decision may not yet truly be final, and that many British policymakers and intelligence officials who internally share our fundamental concerns that this risk that's posed by this cannot be mitigated and therefore should not be permitted. So I want to publicly urge our British allies not to endanger our decades of Five Eyes cooperation by partnering on 5G with Huawei or any other Chinese-directed telecom company, because there's too much at stake here. Countering these malign influence and interference in our democracies, our open society, and our universities will require the government to partner closely with the private sector. On this point as well, I've worked closely again with Senator Warner, along with the chairman of the Senate Intel Committee, Senator Burr, and the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, and leading officials in the intelligence community and law enforcement. Together, we've worked behind the scenes to have candid, classified conversations with America's leaders in business, in venture capital, in higher education, about the many threats posed by China to our national security, to our economic security as well. I've also partnered with Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada to reintroduce the Countering the Chinese Government and Communist Party Political Influence Operations Act. We're going to work to shorten the title of that bill, but it's bipartisan, and it aims to use transparency to combat China's political influence operations in the country and worldwide, by requiring the Secretary of State and the Director of National Intelligence to organize an interagency task force to compile an unclassified report to make more transparent China's disinformation, press manipulation, economic coercion, and influence operations in the U.S. and partner nations. I also believe the U.S. needs to find new ways to bring together partners from Japan, Taiwan, Australia, Latin America, Europe, and elsewhere, who are dealing with the exact same malign influence and interference efforts. We need to learn from our experiences and fashion new ways to collectively counter this growing threat. And finally, just as Reagan did 30 years ago, we must never cease in advocating for the protection of human rights and the rule of law and freedom and liberty. I continue to co-lead the Congressional Executive Commission on China, where we hold hearings and publish an annual report to shine light on Communist China's human rights abuses and violations of the rule of law. From that forum, we seek to give voice to the voiceless inside of China, to the disappeared human rights lawyer, to the detained Christian pastor, to the imprisoned Falun Gong practitioner. The list of political prisoners in China is unfortunately long and growing longer. We continue to do our part to make sure the world knows about what's happening in Xinjiang. These crimes are crimes against humanity, crimes being committed against the Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minorities. That's why in January I reintroduced the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act with Senator Menendez, a bill that requires the Director of National Intelligence in the State Department to report about the regional security threat posed by this crackdown in Xinjiang, and to generate a list of Chinese companies that are involved in the construction and operation of these mass detention camps. It also requires report on efforts of how the FBI is helping to better inform and protect Uyghurs, and how others who are U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents from Chinese government harassment and intimidation here in the U.S. on our own soil. I recently led 24 senators and 19 House members in a letter urging the State Department and the Treasury Department to impose global Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese officials responsible for these human rights abuses. These sanctions are long overdue, and it's time they take action on it. Co-led by Senator Menendez and Congressman Jim McGovern and Chris Smith, our letter also urges the Commerce Department to update U.S. export controls to stop American companies from exporting equipment and technology that enables these crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Advocating for human rights and the rule of law in China needs to be made integral to any discussion that the United States government has with China or with allies and partners about China. In closing, let me say that when the history of this new century is written, there's going to be pages, well, much of what dominates cable news today. There may be some footnotes, maybe even a chapter here or there. But most of it will be forgotten. The one thing I am certain is that when the history of this century is written, it will largely be about the relationship between the United States and China. It is a relationship that will literally define this new era. Now, what do I hope for? I hope for something different. The path that China is currently on is not inevitable. I know for a fact that in the largest, most populous nation on earth, there are millions and millions of people who aspire to more liberty and more freedom and more opportunity. I know for a fact that millions and millions of Chinese citizens travel abroad every year and see what life is like in the rest of the world. And I am hopeful that the day will come when that opportunity will be presented to them in their own country. And that is not the direction they're headed now. It's been a radical departure from the past, in particular with President Xi wiping out collective leadership, positioning himself as the core leader, as he likes to call himself, making himself potentially president for life, and not just trying to control outside ideas, but to prevent them, to block them. The outside ideas he speaks of are individual liberty, human rights, democracy, the worthiness, the value, and the dignity of every single human being. These are the outside ideas he seeks to block. These are also ideas that are not simply American ideas. As I said earlier, they're universal. They also have to be definitional. And so in so many ways, we are hopeful for a different China with different leadership that becomes our partner in solving the global challenges of our time. But we acknowledge that that is not what it is today, and that it increasingly is headed in a different direction. And so we are left with a choice, and that is, in this new century, will the most powerful nation on earth, or the most powerful nations on earth, be free nations of free people who believe that every single human being has certain rights and has value, or will the most powerful nation on earth be one that does not believe in individual liberty, and that all of us exist simply to serve the state? It's a big difference. We have all been born and raised in a world in which its most powerful nation is one that believes that every single one of you, your rights come from your Creator. And the world is better for that. The world will not be a better place if the alternative is true. And that is above all else the challenge before us. And so I thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I believe we'll get it right, but we better start now, because this new century is here and it's being defined even as we speak. So thank you for the opportunity to address this.
Great Redskins teams from 1980s, in particular Super Bowl 17. But
Is that the one they beat us?
I imagine you don't want to focus on that, but it was did come to mind. We'll jump to the content of the of your speech.
I still see John Reagan's running over Don McNeil.
It is a great image. We didn't include it in the video. We cut it for this speech. Well, I want to start where you ended on the fourth pillar in your speech, focusing on the values. And you think about the set of challenges posed by China, which you laid out in your remarks. You know, a lot of people, when they think about how we pursue this competition with China, that democracy and freedom, our system of government, is our comparative advantage against China. And I was curious if you think, as we compete with China now in all the different ways you outlined, do you look at our system of government not just one that we have to protect, but ultimately is a system that will lead to us prevailing in this competition?
Not automatically, not inevitably. In essence, it is a better system of governance. It's certainly the right system of governance, that people have a choice as to who their leaders are. But we have adopted this narrative in the West that it is inevitable, that this is the way the world is going to go. And we forget that the battle against totalitarianism is as old as man itself. In fact, the vast majority of human beings that have ever lived did not live in a free society. The concept that you have rights as an individual and that the state serves you, not you serve your state or the leader, is a pretty modern one. It's about 250, 300 years old in terms of being in practice. So we may have won the Cold War and brought an end to the Soviet Union, did not end the desire for totalitarianism. The second threat is as China goes abroad, and other totalitarians for that matter, but it's really led by China because they are by far the most powerful nation making this argument. What they argue is, look at us. We don't have this sort of societal chaos that you see every day on the news. You don't have these nasty arguments going on Twitter or on the streets. You don't have these massive protests about everything. And we're growing economically. So we offer you more societal stability and comparable economic gains. This is a valid direction that you should choose. And that is very appealing to totalitarian leaders around the world who may go through some of the rituals of democracy in order to sort of cover themselves a little bit and maybe operate on both sides of the world. But elections alone are not a democracy, especially if you control the media. All of your opponents who could possibly beat you are in jail, and at the end of the day, you control the vote counting. And so this has been a very appealing argument, and you can start to see that coalition of nations who could emerge and sort of rally around that sort of system. And so it's incumbent upon us, that's why I made the point at the beginning, the most important thing we can do, step one of everything else, is get our own house in order. If the American model is not appealing as a counter to that, then I don't think it's a comparative advantage, which is why it's so critical for us to always be wary and cautious, not so much about not disagreeing about public policy, but understanding that when we have these domestic arguments, debates, or even showdowns that make it difficult for us to govern and operate, it has an impact a lot more than just the next election. It has an international geopolitical impact that defines the course of history, as Reagan talked about in that speech, the choices we make in navigating that course of history.
Quick follow-up on that one, then I want to go to 5G. But do you think 35 years later, a Senator Rubio or a colleague goes into China, communist China, makes a speech at Fudan University, we could sell our system and speak directly to Chinese people in a fashion that would capture their imagination and hit those inalienable rights which you spoke about?
Except it wouldn't be nearly as much of a curiosity. I mean, one of the ironies about China is that its people are outward looking. I mean, they are very much traveling abroad, investing abroad, doing business abroad. The people of China travel around the world more than ever before, but internally, China is as protective as it's ever been. So it has sort of created, for lack of a better term, a wall to keep out what they now deem as foreign ideas, which you would recognize as religion, human rights, democracy, freedom, concepts like freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They keep out those ideas even as they try to reach out and operate elsewhere in the world. And so you've got this sort of mismatch between an outward-looking people who are now well aware of what the world is like, and an inward-looking system of government that's designed not simply to control dissent or control opposing points of view, but frankly, prevent them, ban them. That's been a big change in the last 7 to 8 years.
So moving from students in China to Chinese students in the United States, no doubt you're aware, and you hit on this in your remarks, the number of Chinese students in the United States. Senator Towns leading a task force with the Reagan Institute, and we heard yesterday that 80% of those in U.S. graduate programs in the STEM areas are foreign students, most of which are Chinese students. And they go back, right? The brain drain we hear about in the 20th century is not playing out that way today. They don't stay here. Do you think that's something we should address? How do we address that? They seem to be going back, and with it, exploiting, taking advantage of the openness of our society to advantage what the Chinese Communist Party seeks to do in China.
We have two fundamental challenges. I mean, the first, nothing to do with Chinese students, is my first question, is that why aren't there more American students going into these fields? Is a fundamental question that we have. The second is it's natural. I mean, it's not just China. You see those numbers also in India and in other places. As opportunities present themselves to do the same work in your native home, it's natural you would want to go back. That's where you grew up, that's where you're from, and that's where your family is. So that in and of itself is more of a reminder of how we need to do a better job of in this country, of attracting more of our own students into these fields. But that is not the more concerning part, and I hate to talk about this because it would be as if I'm not implying that every Chinese student is engaged in this, but even within the research realm, we are aware, both researchers, including American researchers, by the way, not just Chinese, who have either stolen intellectual property and transferred it back, oftentimes for pay. MD Anderson has a big issue going on now. Multiple defense contractors have faced it in the past. There are examples of research projects at major research universities, often funded by American taxpayers, that have been transferred illegally. So there's a real challenge that needs to be looked at. And that isn't to say that 95% of Chinese students, I don't know what the right number is, are not here to steal intellectual property. But if 5% are, or 1% is, that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of valuable intellectual property. It is something that we have to acknowledge.
So staying on the technology side, there was an op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal, aptly referenced, When Reagan Went to China by Tunku Varadarajan. I mispronounced the last name, but he is actually editing this series of essays on President Reagan's speeches. And he notes that China embraced parts of Reagan's vision outlined in this speech that suited its strategic direction, as you noted in your speech: technology, markets, manufacturing, national pride. But it turned its back entirely on the moral lessons we've just spoken about. But on the technology, markets, and manufacturing, a lot of what you outlined, ZTE, 5G, Huawei, these are things that we're trying to prevent. What can we constructively do to actually make sure that we win this competition on the manufacturing side, on the technology side?
Well, first, let me say there's nothing wrong with China wanting to be a world leader in any of these fields. What's wrong is how they're going about doing it. When you go about doing, when you say, I want to benefit from free and open international trade out, but not in, then that's not a fair playing field. And we tolerated it for far too long because we had a view that China was a poor developing nation and that once it became rich and prosperous, it would behave more like us. And they figured out, no, we can benefit from all of the attributes of the international free trade system, but we can prevent all of the things that are harmful to us from it. And that cannot continue to be allowed to happen. The second is the theft of intellectual property. And so, your innovation, you have every right to aspire to have national champions in these fields. What you cannot do is steal other people's innovation and apply it for your gain. And the third is you can't force the transfer of it, which is the other aspect of it, which is you want access to our major market, you have to give us the intellectual property to be able to do it from within our country, and then when we don't need you anymore, one of our countries will do the work and you'll be out of business. So I think that's really touches on the reciprocity part of it. Mm-hmm. And you can talk, look, I'm by instinct someone who believes in free and fair trade, but what I'm describing to you is not free and is not fair. And so I think we should all be guided by a simple principle. China is now a large and powerful and rich enough country that whatever their companies are allowed to do here is what ours should be allowed to do there. And whatever we're not allowed to do there, they should not be allowed to do here. That sounds fair. And there's really no logical reason why we shouldn't approach it that way.
One more question on trade, then I want to go to Venezuela, and then we'll open up for a couple of questions from the audience and get you out of here on time, Senator. President Trump, let's say, makes a trade deal with Xi. Let's say that happens, as many anticipate that will take place in the next month or so. President Reagan was famous for saying, in the context of arms control, you got to trust but verify. How do we do that?
Well, it's hard because, first of all, we can't approach a trade deal as a simple, financial transaction where we're just looking at numbers. They buy more agricultural product, everything else evens out the trade imbalance. If you're not addressing the key industries of the 21st century, in 5 or 10 years, it's going to not just be a bad deal, it'll be a catastrophic one. The second is it has to be enforceable, because even if you catch them violating it, there has to be an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism cannot be, if we catch you cheating, we agree to hold talks. And if those talks don't work, we agree to hold further talks. And if the further talks don't result in anything, then we'll really have further talks. That can't be the enforcement mechanism by which this is pursued, because in 5 or 10 years it won't matter anyways. They will de facto dominate these industries, and then we won't have any companies complaining about unfair trade, because we won't have any domestic or Western countries in those fields. And that's my biggest concern. There's a tremendous amount of pressure with short-termism in the corporate world to say, cut a deal that's really good for us over the next 5 years, because I'm retiring as CEO in 5 years. I don't care what happens 10 years from now. And this has been the first administration, frankly, that's been able to stand up to that in a long time. And I hope they don't abandon that road, because what we are discussing here will determine what the world's going to look like for the next 50 to 100 years, not just for the next 5 to 8 months. And so it's a major challenge that I hope and expect they'll get right.
One twist on that, you have referenced economics and security, and with respect to China, they interrelate in a significant way for all the reasons you outlined. A trade deal that somehow gives a pass to Huawei, do you see that happening?
I don't.
Say again?
I don't. I think that's the one issue because, first of all, we make terrible mistake in putting Western attributes to Huawei. I have no doubt that the people that run Huawei view themselves as a telecommunications company, but they're not, and not in the Western sense. They are not just subsidized, but operate under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, they have leaders of the Chinese Communist Party embedded in its leadership for a reason. It is able to pursue deals cheaper than everybody else, because they don't have to make a short-term profit. In essence, one of the things that China is able to do is they are able to invest around the world in infrastructure and in business deals that make no economic sense, because for them it's a geopolitical play. And the notion that if we control 5G, our other industries will benefit from the standards that will be set from that control. And then the ancillary, but very powerful added benefit of being able to establish backdoors inside the technology to be able to gather defense information, but also commercial information across the core of that system if they control it. So this is not just a straight-up business deal where it's going to the lowest cost competitor. There's much more at play here than simply that, and we have to view it that way. And any trade deal that doesn't recognize that is making a terrible mistake. And frankly, infrastructure, telecommunications in particular, is a national security, national interest imperative for every nation on earth, not the least of which the United States, that relies so heavily on it, from everything to the way we provide people health care to the way we defend our country.
So I'm going to shift regions, but keep the values that we're talking about with us, and go to Venezuela. Images coming out today, really, as you kind of harken back, as you referenced in your speech, to Tiananmen Square. Talk to us about how the values that you've spoken about should impact, should influence what's going on in Venezuela, and what the U.S. government should be doing now that we see this level of unrest kind of rise to these images.
Well, first of all, totalitarianism has existed forever, and it's motivated by different things. Sometimes totalitarianism is in pursuit of an ideology, communism, or before that, Nazism, or I guess concurrent with that. At the same time, you have others that are just an individual that wants to be in power. So just your regular, sort of dictator that just wants to be the leader for life because enjoys that comes with power. In the case of Venezuela, while a lot of people try to approach it as a leftist, Chavista movement, it has some ideological tinge to it, most certainly did in the past. This is the best way to describe the Maduro regime is it is an organized crime ring. That's what it is. It's an organized crime ring. And the loyalty, if you want to call it that, of the individuals embedded in that have nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with the fact that a couple guys control the drug trade, a couple guys control gold mining, a couple guys control currency manipulation. They've gotten very rich from it. And there's nowhere else in the world and no other job they can do that will provide them the same level of wealth and security. And so that's what they're loyal to. So how is it interrelated? You have the people in Venezuela, some of which, frankly, Venezuela actually has never had a right-wing movement. That's what's so funny when they accuse these people of being from the right. It's always been a center-left country across its political spectrum. This has nothing to do with ideology. This has to do with people that are tired of starving, of seeing people die from diseases that are easily cured, because the folks that have empowered themselves, these monsters that have empowered themselves of the government, are drug dealers and bandits who are using the force and strength of government to maintain themselves in power, and they are desperate. They've tried every other alternative. They've tried elections that were rigged and stolen. They've tried protests. They've tried the OAS and the international community, and they're just desperate. And ultimately, they take to the streets, and this is what happens. And you'll see that everywhere in the world that people have an opportunity to pronounce itself. What should the U.S. do? Yeah. Continue to do what we're doing, which is support that desire and that movement. It's ultimately their fight. It is their country and their future. Our job is to stand with them and support them within what we can do, obviously with the caveat that we always have the right to protect our national security interests. And I could argue to you today that Maduro in Venezuela is a serious national security threat to the United States. They have openly invited the presence of Russian military assets in Venezuela. They openly protect drug-dealing guerrilla groups operating from their national territory who are marketing and pushing billions of dollars of cocaine into our streets. They've aligned themselves with Hezbollah. They've aligned themselves with Iran. You find an enemy of the United States and of the free world, and they will find they're an ally of Nicolas Maduro in our hemisphere. And on top of everything else, destabilizing our strongest allies and democratic partners in the region in places like Brazil, Colombia especially, and other countries that are bearing the brunt of the over 3.5 million people who have left that country.
Great.
Over 10% of its population.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to have a couple minutes left, so we have time for 2 questions from the audience. If you could just raise your hand, and one of our colleagues here will come over and give you a microphone. As we're waiting for that, just some administrative notes. We're going to get Senator Rubio out of here on time, and then we'll quickly invite our panelists, Dr. Deal and Senator Talent, to come up to the stage for our conversation. We'll take a bit of a deeper dive into President Reagan's speech, and we have everybody to remain for that panel discussion. But for our first question from the audience, we'll go over here. Sir, please identify yourself.
Thank you very much, Senator. My name's Bob Greenfield. I'm a physician from Annapolis, Maryland. And it occurs to me and my friends that a tremendous amount of finances, money is coming from the United States and from Europe into Central and South America as part of the international drug trade, and it's destabilizing the governments there and their societies, and that's one of the reasons why so many people are trying to come back into this country. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that particular aspect of this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, the first reason why they grow coca and turn it into cocaine is because people want to use it, and they pay a lot of money for it. That includes in Europe and in other parts of the world. There's no doubt that the demand side of it's a big problem. The supply side of it drives it as well. And in Colombia, you have a new president who has been in office now 8 months and is working hard to sort of go after it. But it's hard to go after it when one of the leading organizations involved in the drug trade operate in an open militarized camp on the other side of the border, protected by the Venezuelan military, and the drugs are shipped by the Venezuelan military. People don't believe me. You go down and ask the people who watch this. You see the drug routes. They fly airplanes over the airspace of Venezuela. If you pay the military, they won't shoot you down. If you don't pay them, they'll shoot you down. It's like a toll. And so there was just an announcement that Maduro and the government has shut down airspace over Venezuela. So I think this is a good time to know what the drug flights are, because those are going to be the only ones flying. And but it's astronomical. And a lot of those planes fly into an airfield in Guatemala or Honduras, where the drugs are quickly dropped off and fuel the drug gangs that are destabilizing those countries and creating the violence that's leading to this mass migration that winds up at our border. These things are all interrelated. There's no doubt about it.
Last question. Anyone will ask a question for Senator Rubio before we let him out? Gentleman on the far left over there.
About Hong Kong. And just yesterday, 130,000 Hong Kong people took to the streets to protest the extradition law that the Hong Kong government is considering, as well as in support of the umbrella movement activists that protested in 2014. What more can the United States do to protect the fundamental rights of the Hong Kong people, which, as you pointed out, the autonomy seems to be steadily eroding?
I can tell you the one thing China cares about deeply, the Chinese Communist Party cares about deeply, is its international reputation. They do not like being called out on Xinjiang. They don't like being called out on Hong Kong. They don't like being called out on their abuses internally. They care about it because it impacts their ability to go around the world and do more of the other things that we're talking about. And so that is why, while some people may look at it and say, well, writing letters, giving speeches, passing resolutions, even sanctions are not going to change a nation state, they do care. China is not, President Xi does not want, if you've seen from his recent speeches, does not desire simply to control China. He believes personally that he is the core leader of a nation that's rising to greatness, and that only he, as an individualized leader, can take it to that next level where China assumes its rightful place as the world's sole and most powerful country. Sole superpower, most powerful country. They do care about reputation. They run into it. One of the things they ran into it at the Belt and Road Initiative meetings that just took place is the large number of countries that are increasingly cautious about accepting this investment because of examples in other places where nations have been trapped and have been caught in this debt trap. They do care a lot about their reputation. They do care a lot about international criticism. They are strong to crack down on it internally when it arises. So I think, obviously, the most important thing we can do from here is continue to openly, repeatedly, and unabashedly support the voices of democracy in Hong Kong, who are constantly reminding the world that this is not what was agreed to when Hong Kong was handed over. This is not the level of autonomy and self-government that was specifically agreed to. And from our purposes, I would say that it is just one more example of how they are willing to make promises and assurances that they are willing to break in 10 or 15 or 5 years, whenever the time is right. Remember when they weren't going to militarize those artificial islands in the South China Sea? But they have. And remember when they were going to stop the cyber attacks against the United States? But they continue. Remember when they were going to respect autonomy in Hong Kong? But they haven't. And so we should keep that in mind when we enter trade agreements, and any agreement for that matter. that we are dealing with a group of people who have repeatedly made promises in the short term that they are ready to break in the long term when it suits their interests.
We're going to wrap up. Everybody, please join me in thanking Senator
you.
Rubio for participating today. Chair up here and we'll get going.
Since they didn't drink their water. Yeah. You want to sit there? Let me scoot around a bit, huh?
Okay. Well, everybody, we're just going to move right in. There are some drinks in the back, so help yourself, and we'll move on to our panel discussion. And it's an honor to have Dr. Deal and Senator Talent here. Dr. Deal leads the long-term strategy group. Senator Talent, as I mentioned before, is the co-chair of the Reagan Institute Task Force on 21st Century National Security, Technology, and Workforce.
We need a shorter name for
yeah,
that,
I know.
too.
That's a mouthful. We're going to ask Senator Rubio for a suggestion how to shorten it. And then, of course, former senator from the great state of Missouri. Both Dr. Deal and Senator Talent have written essays, which will go on our website today on the Reagan 1984 speech at Fudan University, and remarkable scholarship and insight, both in terms of the context for President Reagan's speech, but also in terms of lessons for today. So quickly, I thought we'd start off by getting each of you to react to Senator Rubio's remarks, anything that you want to comment on, what you heard and what you didn't hear, both in terms of referencing Reagan's speech, but also the present-day challenges vis-a-vis China. And then I thought we'd jump into your essays and the speech itself. So why don't we start with you, Senator Talent, and go over to Dr. Deal.
Sure. I think the senator's emphasis on human rights was very well placed. I would expand that a little bit. And by the way, I think it's one of the reasons Reagan did what he did in the Fudan speech. I mean, he was able in that speech to talk about what the United States believed in a context where it was as if he was representing the country and personally explaining where America came from, drawing the distinction without saying it as directly because he couldn't because of his strategic goals there. Between the United States and China. I think it's very important that we do that because I've been very pleased with what's happened, beginning with the pivot, but I think especially with what's happened the last couple of years on both the Hill and in the White House, in terms of recognizing the threat, the competition, and developing tools to combat it or to win the competition and to be effective in doing it. What is missing, I think, is an explicit strategic framework that explains why it's important that we win. And I think it's going to be very important to do that if we're going to maximize the effectiveness and the potential of the American system, which I think is stronger than the system they have in China. But it needs a unifying purpose. And I hope we'll develop it. I think we still can, but we need to put all this in a strategic framework. And I think Reagan would have done that if he was here.
Jack, want to add to that or a different perspective takeaway from Senator Rubio's remarks?
I thought he spoke very compellingly about the challenge between democracy and the rule of law, the liberal regime that we have, and the authoritarian alternative that China is promoting. And as some people have said, I think the senator is right that the Chinese are sort of going about trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, and that's a fundamental challenge. I thought that his framework for reorienting our foreign and domestic policy around sovereignty, reciprocity, transparency, and a Reagan-esque commitment to protecting human rights and the rule of law was all very well taken and compelling. I would only add that there is, in addition to the kind of economic and civilizational or political challenge, defense challenge that we need to meet as well. And so working with our law enforcement and our stakeholders in the economic sphere is extremely important and fundamental. It's also important that our military leaders understand that what's happened in the South China Sea is a coming attraction or a preview of China's efforts to, again, make the world safe for an authoritarian regime abroad, and that means protecting, from their point of view, China's sea lines of communications, its supply lines globally. So beyond Asia into the Indian Ocean, into the Mediterranean, into the South Atlantic. So I think we need to think about that as well.
Here, here.
Senator Talon, you were just referencing that you thought a framework is missing. Can you say more in terms of what that framework, if you had to design it right now, you're for president, what that would look like? I mean, Jackie just hit on, you thought the military piece was missing, which is essential to the Chinese approach. I mean, what is that unifying framework? What are some of the elements that need to be
Well, a
focused on?
strategy is defining your highest order ends and the highest order means you're going to use to accomplish it. And I think so we have to define what winning means. In other words, what is it we want to achieve out of this? So Senator Rubio talked about our sovereign national rights, which I think it is the responsibility of every nation to protect. We have to define what those are. Basically, it's the right of the United States to trade and travel and move in the common areas of the world on the same terms as everybody else. We get to sail in the South China Sea, whether they like it or not. So we have to define what winning means, and then we have to explain to our own people, but also to the people around the world, why it's important that we win. And so here, I think the emphasis that began with the Obama administration and the Trump administration has continued on the norm-based international order. I mean, I was talking to a Japanese scholar one time who said, you have to understand, we view the world horizontally, and they, the Chinese Communist Party, view it vertically. Say, we view the world as one where nations relate to each other according to agreed upon norms and resolve disputes through established adjudicative mechanisms or by peaceful negotiations. They believe in a world where the big dogs get the benefits. And in fairness to them, and Marco said this, that's been the world most human beings have lived under for most of human history, and it's certainly the world that's characterized Chinese national history. So that's not a communist thing. That's a kind of national identification. Now, I think the senator was right. If they developed democratic institutions, we would see that express itself in a benign way. Okay? So I think we have to say to the world, to our own people, to our more cosmopolitan young people in Silicon Valley, we are fighting for a world that's just for everybody. We'll prosper under that world. It comports with our values. But we're standing up for everybody here. And I think if we do that, we'll mobilize vast reservoirs of strength in this country and around the world. If we don't, I'm afraid that we'll get things like Project Maven all the time, where people are constantly questioning, why should we help you, you know?
So I want to take a step back and get your summary or takeaway from Reagan's Fudan University speech. And when I first read it, and I think Senator Rubio hit on this, because it wasn't a speech I was familiar with, you could make the argument that President Reagan got it wrong, that it was overly optimistic, and here we are 35 years later, and the only thing that remains open is our country, and they've exploited that, but they remain closed. You both have studied, spent time looking at the speech. Is there more to it? I know you both have an answer to that question. So why don't we start with you, Dr. Deal, and then Senator Talon, you can follow up.
I guess I'll take the other side of that. I was struck when I read the speech at how it gracefully accomplished two goals. One, it drove home to the Soviets, our peer competitor at that time, that we were going to kind of realize their worst fears and not only kind of build on our high-tech technological advances relative to them ourselves, but also work with the Chinese in a way that, again, I think was very threatening to them in the early 1980s, in a period where they were seeing setbacks in Asia and Afghanistan, in a period where they knew that they were behind in the kind of high-tech military competition, they were behind economically. So I think it was very threatening to the Soviet Union in a way that was done without any kind of overt message to that effect. It was more subtle. And then I think vis-a-vis China, it was not as naive as it first seemed to me when I read it. When I looked at it further, it struck me that while the surface was very diplomatic and cordial, at the same time, the president was able effectively to kind of outline the areas in which, on the one hand, we would cooperate with them in the 1980s or for as long as we needed to win the Cold War. But at the same time, he was outlining the areas where we have fundamental advantages as a result of our regime and our system. And so just sort of the obvious case was the kind of human capital talent question, where he talks about in the speech opening up our university systems to Chinese students and professors and the Chinese immigrants who've done so well in our country. That's a double-sided message, because the flip side of that is China needs access, and it needed it then, to our schools and our human capital, our knowledge base and our talent base, to build up its own talent base, and it still needs it. So China's 1,000 talent programs that we read about is ongoing. And the flip side of our concern about Chinese scholars or professors coming to US universities or research institutions and exfiltrating our technology is they still need to do that. So depending on how we look at it, that's a vulnerability, of course, and we need to think hard about how to shore up our exposure. But at the same time, it suggests that there's a kind of deficit that the Chinese have, and they haven't figured out how to address it yet. And so in the context of the competition, we should also think of that as an area where we have some advantages, potentially some leverage to exploit. Another example is he talked about China's, well, he opened the speech with a reference to the Great Wall and the Terracotta Warriors, which are famous examples of great projects, great works of Chinese civilization. They're fundamentally defensive. You know, the wall is designed, historians have written and analyzed that the Chinese leaders depended on the walls when they weren't legitimate enough, strong enough at home to kind of deal well with the outside world. They had to barricade themselves, or they had to prevent flows of people. Terracotta warriors guarding the emperors even in death in their tombs. They had the equivalent of, you know, a Secret Service guard around their elites. That's still true of China in a way. I think Senator Rubio spoke to this when he talked about their fear of outside ideas, their desire to protect, to not just control, but prevent outside influences, as he said, what we recognize as religion or human rights, the rule of law, from getting into China. There's still that kind of defensive crouch in China today because of the nature of the regime, the Chinese Communist Party system. And again, you can see that as, you know, an obstacle and a challenge, but it's also an area where if they're on defense, we should think about ways in which we can be on offense. And so we have a society that is open to a fault and tries to inject transparency and information. So thinking about that competitively, you know, potentially gives us some options and would be playing to an area where we have strength, and President Reagan, I think, recognized that. There are other examples too. I wrote about it in my essay, which is on the website. So
we'll have the link up shortly. Senator, give us some of your thoughts, takeaways from this.
I agree with what Dr. Deal was saying. I think it was the right speech for the time. In fact, I think it was a brilliant speech for the time. He had geostrategic goals. You know, leadership is about setting priorities, and his priority in foreign policy was clearly to win the Cold War, right, against the Soviet Union. And this was a really important operational move that took advantage of 2 decades of tremendous hostility between China and the Soviet Union. I mean, Mao ordered in 1969 a border skirmish. He ordered Chinese troops to attack Russia over the border, and the Russians reacted and threatened, in fact, a nuclear attack. In fact, you know, Mao moved to the midland of the country because he was concerned about actually a nuclear war. So Reagan wanted to take advantage of that, and I agree with Dr. Deal. That was a lot of what he was doing there. He needed to for his own country, but I think he very intelligently really sent some strong signals and unsettled them. One of them was talking about America's values at a time when the voices of democracy in China were very open and very strong. This was the time of the democracy wall near Tiananmen Square. So this was unsettling to the authoritarians. He also, there's a passage of the speech where he's talking about America's and China's shared sacrifice in World War II, and how the United States fought there. And he made the point, we've always been willing to pay whatever price we need to pay to protect our freedom. And then he talked about a couple of lines about rebuilding America's armed forces, which he was doing at the same time. Well, that was the message that, look, we can work together with you, but don't forget, we can defend our freedom if we need to. So I thought it was brilliant for the time, but times have changed. I don't think it was naive. I think, if Reagan, I'm not trying to be too overly critical of our leadership the last, 30 years, but I think things would have gone differently in a lot of respects if Reagan had been running things in the last 3 decades.
So Peggy Noonan, and Jack, you put this in your essay, in her memoir. So of course, Peggy Noonan, Wall Street Journal, opinion writer, trustee of the Reagan Foundation, but of course came to fame as a President Reagan speechwriter, wrote that her instructions were, quote, to get across to the Chinese through the very vigor of our language what a lifting thing freedom is. Take those thirsty minds and pour in cooling draughts of truth. Only Peggy Noonan could kind of capture that with such imagery. When I presented to Senator Rubio about do we need to speak to the Chinese people more, if you had an opportunity to go to Fudan 35 years later, I was listening to his reply, and he seemed to think it wouldn't really work. Now, Jackie, you were talking about we need some cost-imposing strategies, right? Is a language of freedom something we need to use more and direct it more to the Chinese people, or is that of a bygone era?
Well, I think maybe Senator Rubio would agree that he mentioned transparency as being one of the policy initiatives that we need to take, and he talked about domestically we need to inject transparency into our financial dealings so that we know if we're doing business or investing in a Chinese firm that's cracking down on Uyghurs in Xinjiang or part of their surveillance state or their social credit system or benefiting from stolen technology paid for by taxpayers here. But I think he also had in mind, with regard to transparency, trying to promote and inject transparency in their system. And that's always going to be a delicate thing, a controversial proposition. Peggy Noonan actually writes in her memoir of her Reagan years that I think this was this first speech that she wrote for him, and some of that language that you quoted was actually controversial. She had to fight with people in the State Department about keeping it in the speech. So, anytime we try to just speak the truth, take it to the man, defend basic principles in other countries where they're not welcome, it's going to take some moxie and some effort and courage. And it was true, I think, when Reagan gave his remarks, that Chinese, I believe they did not have a live translation broadcast, so they agreed to have a live broadcast of the speech, but
some of it was censored, I believe.
So today, I was thinking when you raised that proposition of giving the speech in Fudan, if they agreed to let us do that, which they wouldn't readily, what would they extract from us in return, and would it be worth it? Because it would definitely be a negotiation. So I think it makes sense to think about ways where maybe we don't have to ask permission to give speeches. I know there are ideas out there of promoting freedom of information in China by forms of the internet that would not be as subject to the cyber Great Wall and China's internet sovereignty program, which is designed, again, to kind of keep out foreign ideas, control what's disseminated within the country. There are probably technological ways in which we can help the Chinese people learn basic things about what's going on in their own country, how the Chinese Communist Party is spending or misspending its money, their money, basic facts like that, what's happening in Xinjiang, what happens to believers, Christian believers, Falun Gong believers, Tibetans. We could probably do more to help the Chinese people understand, basic facts.
Senator, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've been talking before about strategy. So, yes, part of a strategy is defining what the highest order means you're going to use. And I think Marco talked about reputational, the power of ideas, and George Will said after the Cold War ended, and this is a paraphrase, but he said, the collapse of the Soviet Union proves not only that ideas have consequences, but that maybe only ideas have consequences. So I think this needs to be part of the toolkit. Now, I'm going to agree with Dr. Deal about a couple things. Remember, we're dealing now with a very powerful country, and whose leadership feels much less secure than we think they feel. I mean, regime survival and legitimacy is a constant concern for them. So you do have to understand how they're going to react to certain inputs. It may not be the way we think that they were going to react. And I'm a big believer that we deter the Chinese, but we don't provoke them. So, particularly publicly. So a key to that, I think, is what Dr. Deal said before, and when I said here. We have to maintain, the foundation of our foreign policy is an armed forces that are capable of decisively deterring our adversaries, competitors, or aggressors. Because if we don't have that, and we are successful with the other tools in pressuring them economically, pressuring them diplomatically, pressuring them with our ideals, there's a danger that they will respond by expressing themselves in aggression. And I would remind you that happened once before in Asia, right? I'm not saying the two situations are comparable, but I think we need to learn the lesson. We had, from the point of view of the Japanese Empire, boxed them in pretty well, and they decided, well, this is what we're going to do about it. So it is absolutely crucial that we continue this rebuild and that we orient it towards what is now clearly the pacing threat, which is China.
So let's pursue that a bit. Were you surprised that Senator Rubio, in outlining our foreign policy towards China, really didn't harp on our military buildup? Dr. Deal, you noted, or you, Senator Talon, a moment ago, that it was embedded in President Reagan's speech, right? Hey, we're doing a buildup here, so it needs to be constructive, because if you try to do it and challenge us, we'll prevail. Just quick reaction to that not being a feature of Senator Rubio's speech, and then a comment, perhaps, Senator Talon, on how the military component needs to be integrated into this overall strategy you're describing.
Do you want?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would like to. I've been trying for 10 years in the town to get people to recognize the centrality of this, and I'm sure Senator Rubio does. He had other points that he was trying to make. It's the foundation of everything else, because the diplomatic, the economic tools, the thing that gives them life and energy and time to work is, again, the military deterrent. Now, in terms of what we need to do, I think we need to do a lot. We have to maintain presence in more or less the traditional sense, and I think the legacy system's upgraded. It's going to be real. We need more ships. President Obama recognized that when he said we got to shift naval vessels to the Western Pacific. We still haven't really done it because the Navy's too small. But we also have to work very hard on on what Secretary Work, who's co-chairing this task force with us, talked about as a third offset, the advanced programs that are going to form the heart of military superiority in the next generation. So AI, hypersonics. So we have to do a lot, and we have to make up for 6 years under the sequester, which was, as Secretary Panetta said it would be, it was a disaster. It was probably the biggest self-inflicted wound in the last 30 years, ever since I've come to Washington. So the reason I think a lot of people who don't like to talk about it is because they're so worried, and understandably so, about the deficit, and they know it's going to take a lot of money.
Apparently, there's an infrastructure deal coming around for $2 trillion, so apparently the deficit concerns are going wayside on that.
But have an interview on what to do about that. But I think it's people in this town have the mentalities of distressed debtors, which is when they're confronted with the need to find more money, they just don't even want to think about it.
Go back to the subject at hand, Dr. Deal. In your essay, you talk about how Deng Xiaoping was actually really looking at Reagan's speech and the approach, and almost designed the strategy that Xi and the Chinese have been implementing over the past 35 years to go ahead and take advantage of the opening that President Reagan articulated in his speech, perhaps preceded him, through education nodes, transfer technology nodes, that they've been, I mean, my takeaway from your essay, they've been pretty consistent and systematic, and it's resulted in what we see today. Do you want to kind of expand upon that? Because that connects to the military competition straight up.
Sure, thank you. It builds on what Senator Talon just said. You know, in the areas of high technology that are clearly very relevant for the military, Senator Rubio did address them when he talked about how telecommunications infrastructure is a national security issue, because obviously that's relevant for any kind of military operation in the 21st century. You know, if the Chinese own the telecommunications pipes in various places in the world, they will have access to intelligence about our movements there, our forces, the intentions of their leaders. They might have leverage over the leaders that they could use to try to get them to veto, giving us basic access or overflight rights. So our whole way of doing business as a military could be compromised if we don't sort of rise to the challenge, keep up our presence, try to kind of maintain our influence, and upgrade for, you know, a 21st century military competition, which is not the same as a 20th century military competition. And the Chinese, what I tried to get across is the Chinese learned from what the Soviets were writing about what they called the military technological revolution, brought about because of information technology and the revolution in accuracy, precision that would make possible. They learned from what the Russians were writing about it, and then what we were doing that scared the Russians in the period when they couldn't catch up in the early 80s. Chinese military strategists thought, wow, this is so fascinating. This could revolutionize warfare, these computers and the ability to have kind of, with conventional precision strike, strategic effects. It's a revolutionary moment, and a lot of the underlying technologies are dual use. And now we're going to have access to the United States, and they're going to help us.
This is the 1980s.
Yes, and they're talking about AI, as Senator Talon just did. I mean, they're talking about artificial intelligence because that's relevant for the targeting and the missile system. So you can trace sort of where we are today and what we now refer to as China's anti-access area denial challenge or counter-intervention challenge to our forces, all the way back to writings in the early 80s. And I think in some sense, the Chinese strategists were kind of licking their chops about getting access to our high-tech know-how because it would help them economically, but also militarily.
Senator Talon, you also, I didn't mention this in your bio, but are commissioner on the China Economic and Security Commission. U.S.-China Economic Security Commission. You've done so for a number of years now. When looking at the full gamut of issues, when I asked Senator Rubio about the education and the migration of Chinese students to U.S. universities and graduate programs, my recollection of his response to me was, well, the first thing we have to do is get more U.S. students in those graduate programs, which makes sense. But I wonder, Senator, if you've taken a look and have more thoughts on how do we deal with that aspect of the competition, one that clearly is advantaging the Chinese. President Reagan, during the Fudan speech, spoke of communications and relationship between MIT and Fudan. And I think it's fair to say that, I mean, maybe MIT has done well in terms of tuition payments coming from China, but China's really done well from that relationship. Fudan, in terms of what's migrated from MIT to Fudan in China.
Well, if you're talking about should we consider restricting the number of students who can come here from China, or is that
well, how do we deal with the problem set? And that's one potential solution.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I think we have to. This is one of these situations where everything really does need to be on the table, and you do have to consider all that. I think the odds, given where we are now, especially, and given as far as the Chinese have come, I think defensive measures, trying to protect what we have, although we ought to do that in the right areas, export controls and the rest of it. I don't see that as basically the path to winning. I don't think that is going to tap our strengths. I think we have to start moving forward more quickly ourselves. And so I think when the senator's instincts to say we have to get more Americans or find ways to keep those Chinese students here is the area my instincts are that we would need to go down. I don't have a problem if it would assist us in this with restricting that. I think if we're going to win, if this is the defining competition of the 21st century, and if we do think we deserve to win, and if we want to win, then we have to make that the priority. I talked about priorities before. but and I think that might also have real downsides. We have our own reputations to protect, right, around the world. So I think we have to take advantage of our own strengths. Basically, that's the way we're going to win, rather than believing we can cut them off from access to different kinds of things, although we certainly need to do that with regard to protecting technology, et cetera. And I think if we have the right strategy and we get all the stakeholders behind it in this country, I think there's already bipartisan support. I'm very optimistic about it. And we haven't talked yet about the weaknesses that the Chinese are confronting. We should not look at them as 10 feet tall either. But I do think we have an excellent chance if, Churchill quoted, I think, Sir Edward Grey as saying that the United States is like a gigantic boiler. Once it starts to heat up, there's no limit to the amount of energy it can generate. And I still believe that about this country, and certainly Reagan did.
And we're not at the boiling point with respect to this issue yet?
No, well, we're getting there, though. I mean, there's a lot going on people are really waking up and defining what the problem is. I thought Mike Pence gave a great speech, although what was missing from that was what was in Reagan's speech. What is it about us, right? But I think that's probably going to be coming. I wouldn't be surprised to see him or Pompeo or maybe the president do that.
One more question, then we'll open up questions from the audience, get everybody in the room involved. Senator Rubio hit on the Chinese use of dual-use technology, both for military purposes, also in his pillar on human rights in terms of use as a tool of suppression. Reagan used China, Jackie, as your essay outlines, as a means to tweaking the Soviets, the Russians. It seems to me that the way we're going to prevail and get a good outcome in this competition is working with our allies. Reagan was trying to do it with China, not an ally, but trying to advance. We're going to have to work with allies. Senator Rubio called out Australia for doing the right thing in his judgment vis-a-vis Huawei, called out Great Britain for possibly or on the cusp of making what he would view as a wrong decision. What is the approach with allies generally vis-a-vis this issue set, and specifically with respect to dual-use technology? How critical is that? 30 seconds or less for a complicated subject. But go ahead. Why don't you take a stab at that, Dr. Dillon? Senator Talent, you could supplement.
I agree with the proposition. It's very important. Any solutions that we adopt here without working with the relevant other actors are not sufficient. That will not be an effective approach. So we have to find a way of working with our allies. And at first it's an education mission, and some of them are ahead of us in understanding what China's really been up to with the Belt and Road Initiative or its economic strategy more broadly, so we can learn from them. And I think all of our media outlets have done a great job kind of publicizing, injecting transparency into what's going on with debt trap diplomacy, or the extension of China's safe cities or its efforts to extend surveillance in other places in the world. Are we using air quotes for safe cities now? Is that the authoritative way? Safe for authoritarians or dictators. So first, there's an education function. We need to understand what's at stake. I heard a representative from a European government say a few years ago, we understand what China means, what made in China 2025, and wanting to be a manufacturing leader. They're coming for us. So in some ways, some of our allies were even ahead of us in understanding what was going on. But we need to continue to talk to them and work with them. And I think while we can't be defensive in all areas, as Senator Talent said, and we should build on our strengths, in certain areas, critical areas, clearly we need to prioritize protecting certain kinds of intellectual property or technology. And we need to work with our allies in order to be able to do that. There's just no way around that. So
I'm all for the defensive. I just don't think that's going to win. I think it's gotten to the point where we're not going to win it that way. But,
any comments on the allies front?
I agree in terms of the dual use, and there's the strategy very important, because they need to understand also on their own terms why it is important that we as a group win this and what that means. And if they do, then I think they're more likely to cooperate. And I will say, and I'm glad the Senator Rubio let some air in for the British now. They're going through a very difficult time. And
what are you
I would be
referring to?
very surprised if the Chinese are not pressuring them, because the British are looking for reassurances about trade partners, et cetera, and I'd be shocked if the Chinese are not using that on this issue. So let's see what happens and what they do when they get past this. And you know, the allies thing goes both ways. We need to be understanding of when allies are going through a rather extraordinarily difficult patch, which I think they are now.
One quick follow-up on that, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. You know, in addition to, you mentioned Great Britain and referencing Brexit and the difficult time they're going through, how much do you think the fence-sitting on the part of Great Britain or Germany vis-a-vis Huawei is tied to our allies watching this trade negotiation between the U.S. and China and worried that there'll be a trade deal President Trump and President Xi will embrace, and post-trade deal, all things that are of a concern will no longer be of a concern, and therefore they get caught on the wrong side. I mean, is there a little bit of hedging here because they don't know where the U.S. will be? Or do you think the U.S. will say...
Jackie may have some more insight on insight on that than I do. I'll just say this. I do not anticipate, if you look at where the president has been coming on this issue from day one, how strongly he feels about it, it's obviously a core issue for him, and how energized the executive branch agencies are. I think we may get a deal, and I think it wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing to get a deal where they make some concessions on specific issues with a trust but verify thing. This is going to be a back and forth. There's an ebb and a flow for some time. I don't believe that the Trump administration is going to accept any IOUs and give any huge benefits to them without waiting for performance, which I don't think is going to happen. They are not going to structurally change the way they manage their economy. So I see this contest going on for some time, although there may be times when the tension backs down a little bit, some agreement for a while, and then back up again. But I think we're in this world for a while.
Anything out there, Jack?
Just the message I think that at least some parts of the administration have been propounding that I think is effective is even if a deal is signed, that's not the end of the challenge, and we are in a competition now with the Chinese and with their alternative system, and Xi has not been timid about saying, you know, we have an alternative, we are here, the United States is in retreat, and we are expanding, and so this is not just a question of one deal and trade. This is a much deeper competition, and it's going to go on, you know, past next week or the week after, or whenever any announcement comes about a deal or no deal. It's much more of a long-term issue.
Great. Well, we have time for 5 minutes of questions. Why don't we go to the gentleman here in front, Patrick? Yeah, great to see you here. Watch out. You got an expert asking experts questions.
No. Patrick Cronin, now at the Hudson Institute. A wonderful program.
Pat, you ought to come up here and answer the
no, but and I'm not going to ask you about specifics because
Please,
we could get into details.
If you do, I'm referring it to Dr. Deals.
But I want to go back to where you started, Senator Talent, really the question of strategy.
Yeah.
Because I think that is key. And you came very close to using the word end state, I think, or you certainly referred to a theory of victory. But do we have a comprehensive strategy? So I know next month, welcome news that the Defense Department will release a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy for defense, for the Department of Defense. But it will not be the comprehensive policy that China's practicing. And it's not all about China, of course, and it's not all anti-China, but nonetheless, there's a big China component to it, that we need that theory of how do we come out of this. I want to just ask you about the weaknesses, therefore, by not having more than a defense strategy out there. For instance, even the paramilitary, the para-naval exercise activity, the maritime militia is the front lines of China's maritime defense and offense and coercion in the South China Sea. And I think just this week we've declared that we will now treat them like U.S. Navy vessels or Chinese PLA Navy vessels if they're acting badly. And
well, they're under the control of the Central Military Commission.
They are
right?
indeed.
I mean, in other words,
but
the Chinese are treating them as the military.
So the question then is how do we deal with the fact that they're using these indirect strategies, comprehensive strategies, from cyberspace to how they treat their own people to using paramilitary, paranaval forces, and how do we start to get our own, not only our strong defense back, but also strong cyber and technology and technological dominance and education and other factors that are going to be important because they're going to pick apart our weak links, even if we're really strong on defense. Yes, sir.
I testified about a month ago for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I took what you're saying, and I agree with that, but I flipped it and took a more optimistic view because I really feel this way. I said there is an analogy here, which obviously is not perfect in a lot of respects, but I think there's a similarity between the 1945-55 period, when the American political establishment went from viewing the Soviets one way, then began to view them another way, then realized what that meant in terms of the dangers to the United States and the fact that, in essence, we had to totally alter our strategy, and then in that 10-year period of time built the national security apparatus that, 6 presidents used after that to prosecute the Cold War. So I think we're in a situation now where what you're seeing happening is the organs, the agencies of government, including the Congress, are building the apparatus of a new national security strategy. Now, you're right, we're doing it before we have the strategy. So, and that's, we've talked about that up here, we need that. But I'm very pleased, because this town doesn't normally move very quickly, but we've seen CFIUS reform, right? We've seen the Build Act, we've seen AREA. Congress is churning this stuff out. And the department is now really treating China as the pacing threat, and I hope this new defense strategy has some actual operational concepts in it.
And we actually named China in strategy.
Yes, we did it. So, yes, we have to catch up, I think, with the strategic framework, and this is going to be the challenge for this president, and if it's a different one 2 years from now, the next one, because that has to come at that level, right? The president doesn't necessarily have to be the one who, but that's the highest level of political leadership. So I'm pleased with how much is happening. We're doing a lot, but I do agree we need to. A strategy organizes it. Everybody knows what we're trying to accomplish, and then they all go to work with it, and we don't have that yet. Not as concrete as it needs to be. Not as tangible.
Another question from the audience. Gentleman here in the front. A microphone will be coming your way real quick here.
John Vandekamp from Annapolis, the Reagan Associate. Senator, Doctor, and Roger, good to see you again. We've talked about everything but space. Minister Bridenstine has a national priority to get our people, thank God, on the moon in 2020. What threats will the Chinese pose to us achieving that objective, in your judgment?
Get the question?
Yeah,
Why don't you repeat it?
Sorry. The question was, what threats will the Chinese pose to our ability to get back to the moon?
Yes, and farther out in space and in our presence there.
Well, the Chinese talk about space as a commanding height of warfare, and they're very keen. They've been very active, as you know, sir, in launching all kinds of platform satellites. They have their manned space program. It's very impressive. And I think for a long time they could think of space as an area of asymmetry where, they would write about how we have more things in space than all the other countries in the world combined. But that time is drawing to a close, or the trends are that time is drawing to a close, as they have, their alternative to GPS, BeiDou. They have weather satellites, communication satellites. They are becoming, or they are on the road to becoming, dependent on space the way we are. So whereas before they could say, we can use our anti-satellite, our various weapons for disabling our American space-based capabilities, now they're going to be on the other side of that as well. They're going to have to think about their dependence on space for their ability to project power, do things that they need to do in the rest of the world. So it's no longer, or it's on the path to no longer being an area where, they have the anti and we are on the kind of defensive side. It's going to be an area where we're both competing, and a question about who has, superior space situational awareness, and can we establish some sort of deterrence regime or not? What are the implications of that? But I agree, it's understudied, it's extremely important. We talk a lot about, the digital or the telecommunications aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, or the One Belt, One Road program, but it's also it's focused on gaining China access to equatorial positions for their space program. So we should keep that in our minds as well. It's not all just about Huawei, it's also about Chinese space ambition, and it's clearly, another area where we are going to be competing, and it should be part of it. To the extent that we develop a comprehensive strategy, it has to be part of that.
No question.
Anything you want to add there, Jim?
But at least we're able now. The Assistant Secretary for Acquisition for the Air Force testified before the China Commission and recently, and he said, we are now able to refer to it as a domain of war. Not that we want, obviously. Our object is to deter. But now we can plan on the reality that the Chinese view this not only as a domain of war, but the next war they believe is going to be, and it fought in the information domain, and that includes space. And I think the president's pushing for a space force, a separate service, whatever you think the structure ought to be, has at least raised the profile of the issue in the Congress and in Washington, which was, I think, tremendously important. And I'm not so sure that a separate service is a bad thing for this. The Chinese have a strategic support service, a separate service, which is both cyber and space. So certainly we need to do something within the department to pull space out, whether a separate service or treat it like the nuclear Navy, or the Marines in relationship to the Navy, or something like that. But it needs to be treated separately, and we need to get somebody like a Hyman Rickover of space to run it and go in there and kick some butt and get things done quicker than we usually do them.
I hear Secretary John Lehman in New York rolling his
get
eyes
John
after
in.
it. But all right, well, we'll end it there. I want to please join me in thanking Senator Talent and Dr. Deal. Really helping us mind these principles and this discussion. Thank you for everybody for participating. Look forward. Encourage you to go to the site, look at their full essays, and see you at our next Reagan Institute event. Have a great afternoon.